I'm the president of Emerging Heart Spiritual Center, so we're doing this in conjunction with him. We typically have a series, like on Sundays, we have Spiritual Roundtable, and so we invite in different speakers to talk about, their perspectives, their journeys, and so forth. And then along with that, we often have a period afterwards where we discuss things and we all give our various perspectives. Um, it started out in somebody's living room, and maybe somebody read a book and they're like, "Hey, have you read this?" And I think it was partly about, I was raised this way, but I have a lot of questions. And so they were on their own journeys searching and so forth. Um, the title of this one here is Deconstructing the Spiritual Journey. Um, so I'll let you go, Chris, and just give your portion.
Sure. So I'm Chris Seeman. I'm the Vice President of Emerging Hearts, along with Ron here. And I think that one of the reasons why people are attracted to this community is because everyone recognizes and values the fact that each person is striving to move forward on their own journey. And so we thought it would be a good way to start out this series by talking about what do we mean by spiritual journey? What does it look like? What are some of the dimensions of it that it might be helpful to acknowledge so that when we get together with folks and listen to other people, we can kind of understand and recognize what they're talking about.
Thank you. As we were talking, one of the first things that we mentioned was to, in some sense, to define the spiritual journey. Both of us have been influenced to a degree by the hero's journey from Joseph Campbell. You might know this. It's been used. The basic structure has been used in movies like originally. This had a big influence upon Star Wars. See it in like movies, The Matrix, Lion King, so forth. There are basically 12 steps in this. We'll probably leave this presentation to go about an hour long. We might just be covering a portion of this and then revisiting the rest of it later on. So we were going to take each step of this hero's journey to lay it out. You actually start in the ordinary world, and that is actually the first stage of the journey as well. So, do you want to go ahead and talk about this in relationship to your own journey, Chris, and what you experienced? And
Yeah, I think maybe we should talk about our own journeys to kind of give a reference point for what we will be talking about. Both Ron and I began life within a religious tradition, and we developed in very different ways in relation to that. It's not the same tradition, but we both are familiar with the phenomenon of fundamentalism in one form or another.
Mhm.
Um, I myself was a member of a Southern Baptist Christian school where I accepted Jesus as my personal savior at the age of 11 and sort of operated within this idea that my life might have a purpose and I could actually search for it and discover it and all this within the context of that religion. Along with that uh, call to the journey, as it were, also went a lot of inhibiting factors that fundamentalism brings, such as kind of anti-intellectualism. World is only 5,000 years old. You are one of the saved, everyone else is doomed, that kind of stuff, which never sat very well with me. When I went to college, I found it was very difficult for me to maintain all these beliefs. And finally, I decided I had to reject them because I didn't feel like this wasn't a reality. This was all kind of a terrifying prospect to live in such a world, and I didn't want to live in that world. So I rejected that and felt an incredible upwelling of affirmation, not from within me, but from something outside me. And I say, well, whatever that was that kind of drove me to that moment of rejection, was is obviously important because that's, in a sense, that's my mentor. That's what's pulling me forward. And so I ended up studying religion, studying world religions, studying, trying to find out where did these ideas come from? Is there any truth in them? And how should I make sense of them? So much of my journey was an intellectual one, but then also was embedded within building a family, which took place in the context of the Catholic Church, where even though I wasn't Catholic, I had to promise to raise my children Catholic. And ultimately, I ended up initiating into the Catholic Church. So for me, I moved out of one religious tradition, went through a period of intellectual questioning, and ended up in another, but certainly with a different perspective on the value of questioning and, in a sense, the necessity of questioning for the spiritual journey. And now I teach courses on it at the local university. So that's kind of my story. I mean, there's more to it, but I think I'll leave it at that and let Ron take over.
Yeah, that's definitely the short version, I'm sure. You did cover a number of stages within. We'll go to call to adventure, um, refusal to call. I don't know if you talked much about that. But then also meeting the mentor, and the last stage of the ordinary world is crossing the threshold. Anything additional you want to add there, or
I
I
think I'll
can
leave it at that
continue?
for now, and then you can fill
Yeah. Okay.
in some of the details on your story, and then we can kind of use those to build a picture of what the spiritual journey might be.
Yeah. So my own self, I was pretty young when my parents started studying to be Jehovah's Witnesses. So I would say about I think 4 years old, they were baptized and they were studying. So I was very little, didn't know a thing, and so I was pretty much raised within that belief system. It's very fundamentalist in its own way, but they would look at a lot of Christianity and going so far as to not being a part of mainstream Christianity. They're very much in a polar opposite of God versus the devil, type of situation. Anything that was outside of them was of the devil, and they represented the side of God. Um, so um, think about that. We also called it the truth, So it's kind of like this is very definite. And I essentially, believed that as being the truth. And there's a lot of things that they do to keep you separate. So I was not involved typically with extracurricular activities in school, even though I was very athletic. So I played things like backyard football, baseball, basketball, whatever the season was. We were playing that sport. But I was pretty good at things like football and track and even wrestling. And if I hadn't been a witness, pretty sure that I would have been involved in athletics, but kept me out of that. And essentially, my focus was on like religious and spiritual things. Um, Read the Bible through numerous times in smaller chunks. I remember, reading things like the Book of Proverbs and wanting to understand like the wisdom of Solomon and so forth. We went to, we had like several meetings a week. We went door to door, and we went to conventions, all within the belief system to reinforce that and so forth. Um, the call to adventure stage was really about, there were certain things that happened in my life that started to maybe make me question or pull me in another direction, even though, initially, it was my belief. I was going to get baptized around the age 14, which was pretty common for a lot of my friends to get baptized pretty young. And that's very beneficial for the religion itself because it kind of like locks you in. If you, once you're baptized, then they can disfellowship you, essentially excommunicate you. Um, so they really want, and then at that point in time, you become ostracized by your family. They don't talk to you and so forth. So it's just another means that the religion would use to trap you in. Now, when I went to get baptized at 14, one of the elders said to me, "It's like, well, are you doing it just because all your friends are?" And I was kind of got mad, and I was like, "Oh, maybe that's the case, you know." So I had waited until I was 17, and once I reached 17, I think my mother was probably worried because once I got to be 18 and I graduated and got a job and stuff, she was probably worried that I might go in my own direction and not remain as a witness. So I ended up getting baptized at 17, not really understanding what that would mean for me as well. So I did graduate and I did get a job and I got a car and I got a Camaro, and and then I got a girlfriend, but she wasn't a witness, and so that started to um, cause problems. Even before that, one other factor was the fact that when I was about like 13, 14, my sister, who was 16, had also committed suicide. So I believed up to that point that, according to our beliefs, she was going to be resurrected. I would see her in paradise. But it wasn't like the typical Christian view of where the person would go to heaven after they die. You have to be a loyal witness, and then you're going to be reborn on earth if you're dead, or you're going to go into the new system, which they felt that Armageddon was imminent. So um, basically, me starting to date someone else, that put me at odds. I tried to convert them initially, and then they almost got sucked in, but I'm sure their family was resistant to that and so forth. Um, and then they started trying to convert me. So we did a lot of arguing about religious perspectives and issues and so forth. Now the other thing is that as a witness, we were discouraged. It was generally did not happen that you would go to college. More recently, they might allow you to go to like a trade school, to at least have a career, maybe make more money. So that would be like a 2-year associate degree, something like that. But my girlfriend was actually going to college, and so I happened to pick up a copy of a book she had in school. It's called Logic and Critical Thinking. And I started to use the analysis of things like fallacies, premises, conclusions, all that to kind of deconstruct what was being said. Um, and I remember at a certain point when I had basically, because of the nature of the relationship, um, I'd kept it secret for a while, and then I confided in a friend, and they turned me, and I got into fellowship. And then I started to just take in and deconstruct logically to listen to what they're saying. And like I was looking at this, I'm like, all of this is assumed. They just say something, but there's no evidence to back it up. That's what they were missing. It was just kind of like this self-reinforcing.
Circularity.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Another thing too was my girlfriend at the time, again, like back then we were both going to the library and researching things, trying to bolster our own point of view and so forth. But in that process, we encountered certain things, and those maybe changed our trajectory. So one for her was she had gotten the Joseph Campbell, Bill Moyer's PBS series, The Power of Myth, essentially. And so I was a pretty big fan of Star Wars, um, even though like I think basically it was like my parents were largely ignorant of the story of Star Wars, so they weren't necessarily opposed to it. But because you had ideas in it like the Force, which might be like magic to them, which they did not support or believe in. But I identified highly with Luke in that story, and then just learning about that added a depth of spirituality to Star Wars, and I didn't just see it as a pretty cool movie or something like that. It had much more depth. So I think there came a point where I realized that I couldn't go back, that I had changed. Another one of my mentors was Scott Peck. When I was going to the library, I happened to see this book on the shelf, and it was called People of the Lie, The Hope for a Healing Human Evil. But Scott Peck was someone who was a psychologist or a psychiatrist, I believe. And so he gave like a lot of case studies, and there was an example in the book that about a suicide in a family, and that allowed me to analyze what had happened with my sister and to help me to understand it in a different way, that it was basically like she was at an age where she had guilt for having desire to she was with a boyfriend, um, and wanted to take it further, but for witnesses, a lot of them ended up getting married young, because that was the only way they could have sex, you know. And so if she would either get married to him, she was 16, he was 19. Both my other sisters had gotten married at 17. My parents had allowed this, but again, it was a thing like, okay, we'll let you get married to somebody within the organization, and then basically you're trapped here, you know, whether they saw it that way or not, but that
Right.
seemed to be pretty common. So it's like my sister had to deal with the guilt. Basically, if she goes against what the belief system is, and she's displeasing her parents, she's displeasing the religion, and she's displeasing God, you know. And so basically, her way out was to take her own life, you know. So um, yeah,
So,
it's
but by being able to use Peck's sort of insights on psychology, you could better understand how she had trapped her into making that kind of decision, and also how kind of the culture of the community sort of reinforced that kind of thinking.
yeah. And I think it applied to my own situation because I was dating someone who wasn't a witness. We had gotten involved sexually, and but I was like, after having seen what my sister had done and gone through, I did not see that as an option. So in some sense, I was more resilient, and was not going to let them influence me. I originally had no intention of leaving, but now it's easier to understand in hindsight that by leaving was kind of like the call to adventure, in Campbell's story. Um,
Yeah, well, maybe I can jump in there. A couple,
sure.
I think there was two things I wanted to bring up that in studying religions and studying religious traditions and all this, um, I would say that the purpose, or one purpose, of religion as a body of tradition that's handed down, both beliefs, practices, virtues, values, and so on, is function is to actually people go on a journey.
Hmm.
It is to enable them to individualize their journey within the language that exists of previous generations. And but the tragedy, of course, is that it often doesn't do that. And it often fails to do that because of the sorts of psychological and sociological dynamics that I think Peck and others would sort of observe, is that human beings they prefer stability and comfort over adventure and growth.
Hmm.
And so even
Sure.
though you have, I mean, and often when you mention baptism, I mean, that's, I think, one of the interesting things of my journey is the Southern Baptists didn't think to baptize me when I
Got saved.
converted, as it were. And
Yeah.
so I had the privilege of being baptized into the Catholic Church at, I think I was 45, 46 or something like that. So with all this understanding of what the ritual actually meant and how it was enabling me to make my individual journey part of this vast story, right? This story that enabled and that was really exciting. And so for me, that was the call to adventure.
Hmm.
And but then when I came to teach others about this, it's like they aren't taught that they have no concept of what that is. And so, part of, I guess, part of the what I take out of my own journey, my own journey to understand all that was, well, now I'm in a position that maybe I can, I don't know, mentor is probably too pretentious a term, but that I help other people who are at these stages where they either and it could be, starting from within a faith where they're sort of part of it, that they've embraced that language and trying to get them to push themselves further, or people without any particular religious tradition, just to get them to see that, well, there are all these models that are present within human history of people who have done this, and religions provide one way that, but you still need to figure it out. Just because there's a structure in place for people doesn't mean that there's no questioning, that there's no discernment, there's no discovery.
Hmm.
But again, this is, because there's a wonderful, my favorite book is the anthropologist Mary Douglas, How Institutions Think. And so I assume, did something similar with Peck, only she's trying to understand how institutions create these, impediments to
Hmm.
people actually doing what the institutions are there to help them do. So, but yeah,
Hmm.
my one of my insights is always the grass is never greener on the other side. The challenge is the journey, no matter where you are and where you're coming from.
Hmm. One of the things you had mentioned was about the belief, like being creationist, and that was essentially how I was raised to believe, thinking that the world was like 6,000 years old. And there were places along the way where they would kind of like, put up a fence. So, like an example would be in high school and you're studying biology and you're learning about evolution, and so forth. Typically, they didn't want you to take biology, or something like that. um, but for me, at a certain point in time, another one of my mentors became Carl Sagan. And I remember reading his book Cosmos and learning that like monkeys, that there's 99% genetically similar. We share most of our DNA. I'm like, oh, okay. Um, so, and I think for a time, my science became religion because to me it was like more concrete. It was more absolute. But I remember one time I was driving along with my dad, and it was still at a point where, obviously he was still in, but I had a newer understanding of the cosmos, of Earth, evolution, and so forth. And he's talking about coal seams on the road, like they would cut out the road and there would be various coal seams all along there. And it's like, so I started asking him questions. I was like, so where do those coal seams come from? He's like, oh, that's like dead plant matter, It's like, and I said, oh, there's all those layers. How long do you, how long did it take for each of those layers to form? And so he's in his head intellectually, he knows what the truth is, you know, but according to religion, he can't acknowledge that, you know. So an example might be, I think it might have been Leonardo da Vinci, where, he was like, they would find fossils on the top of mountains, and it's kind of like, well, how did these get here? Now, of course, the Christian fundamentalists might say, well, the devil put those things there to, deceive you and make you question and so forth, So it was pretty interesting.
Well, yeah, that's another irony, is that you have, in order to, so that religions present a narrative, right? They present a narrative about how the individual relates to the cosmos and to its ultimate source in God.
Mhm.
But then there's this tendency, in order to defend the narrative, you end up making these arguments that actually destroy the narrative. That you're saying, well, it means this and it means that, and you can't think that or this. And in the case of creation, it totally flies in the face of what the whole idea of creation is all about, which is about our connectivity with everything and the wonder of it all. And
Mhm.
so to have religions be focused on, well, that means that we have to reject this evidence that we see and that evidence that we see, and twist this evidence to make something else other than what it is. Yeah, then it's just at best it's a distraction. At worst, it's just it's a distortion of the whole idea behind creation.
Mhm.
So yeah, so being able to, I guess this is one of the things that probably nurtured me along my way, is that I much of my education was in I was at Catholic universities where the idea of the harmony between faith and reason is
Mhm.
essential. That it's
Mhm.
not just that you can find a compatibility between the two, but you must, because if you don't, then you live in two realities. Then there is no universe. There's just reality over here and reality over there, and that never shall the twain meet. And again, it undermines the whole idea
Mhm.
of what faith is, and and why reason exists. Why we have the ability to discover things. The universe
Yeah.
is intelligible to us. And that was, again, back to Sagan, that was something that moved Carl Sagan so much. He says, we are in his perspective, he says, we are the,
The universe contemplating
on
its own
well, yeah,
existence.
on the one hand, it's like, we're so small and so seemingly insignificant, which is
Yes.
true. But at the
Right.
same time, we are the consciousness of the cosmos. We have
Right.
no knowledge of any other part of reality that is able to find meaning and patterns and all that within, rather than just being animals governed by stimulus. So it's like, for him, that was a revelation. I mean, and that caused that great wonder in him when he wanted to understand things so much. And that's a spiritual journey, I think.
Mhm. When I was a witness, like we had a program to kind of like teach people to go out in the field, to go door to door, and so forth. But it was like that. There were certain things about. I mean, I remember I gave my first presentation. I was 6 years old. Like as soon as I learned to read, so I was doing like reading a Bible passage, or something like that. Um, so then later on, once I came out of there, then I started doing presentations, but it was kind of like to share the things that I was learning, because I realized pretty quickly that you could read an entire book, and unless someone else had read the book, there was no way you could convey everything was in it, even if you did a presentation of it. One of those presentations, though, was about the history of science. And basically how it started. So it used to be like, for instance, that philosophers would sit around and argue things, and whoever had the best argument was the one who was right. But then later on with science, then they actually started to perform experiments to prove. So one example would be, do heavier objects fall faster than lighter objects, you know? And so common sense might tell you one thing, but the truth is that they fall at the same rate, you know? Um, so another example within the book was about optics. So with optics, then we developed things like microscopes and also telescopes. So we could see things that were very small, and we could see that there were microbes, and these were the things that were making us sick and so forth. We could have telescopes, and then we could see planets further away, and realizing that we're not the center of the universe. So we had to change our perspective. And I think this is what led to what would be called the Age of Enlightenment, where people probably had this big shift going from religious indoctrination, and then maybe were more into science and so forth. So, that was a big deal for me. Another was like when I was studying things like logic, to understand bias and not to uh, look at others, but to look within and say, what is my bias? You know, so like religiously, it was very easy for them to look at another religion, like say the Mormons or something like that, and say, well, they're wrong, because of this. It's like, but why don't you apply those same principles to yourself? Do your own self-reflection and to question your own bias. And that's typically the self-reflection they would not undergo or do. Because if they had, they probably would not continue to believe it.
So the journey. Um, so in Campbell's understanding, I mean, and Campbell was based his model on the comparative study of literature, myth, etc., throughout the world, and he tried to isolate a common pattern. And we shouldn't be surprised that there is a common pattern because all the people having these journeys are humans. They all have the same, some universal, psychology, universal needs. Um, One of the things that I think is very important about Campbell's setup is that you have not only the hero leaving the comfort and leaving the presuppositions that they begin with and discovering something else, but they also bring something back.
Mhm,
And this is something that one finds also in the literature of psychology, right? The early 20th century psychiatrist Abraham Maslow,
mhm,
he constructed the so-called hierarchy of needs, things, universal needs every human being has. And it's like a pyramid with, physiological needs at the bottom. And then there's sort of sociological needs, psychological needs, love and belonging, self-esteem, things like this. Then you get into more intellectual things like, intellectual stimulation, the experience of beauty. And in his initial model, at the top of it was what he called self-realization. Because again, his goal was to study people who seemed to be able to live well rather than to study people who are challenged and struggling with things. What is it? What is their secret? How do people live well? It's like, well, they self-actualize, they achieve their goals and so forth. And then he reflects and say, well, no, there's something more than that. Because it's not all about them. It has to begin with them. It has to begin with understanding who you are and what the world around you is. But then ultimately, he added that capstone, which he called transcendence or self transcendence. And his point was that human beings fulfill their ultimate potential by getting over themselves. And whatever insight they have gained in struggling to understand themselves, they're able to bring that insight or that boon, as Campbell would put it, or even just some notion of serving others, serving the common good in some unique way that draws upon their own experience. For Maslow, that was essential, and it's also, I think, essential um, for any authentic understanding of the spiritual journey that it is ultimately not about yourself, but even though it has to begin with yourself, because
mhm,
you're the starting point from which you think, feel, and act, and it's until you've developed yourself and changed yourself, you can't help others. But there's always this outward movement in the hero's journey. They bring something back, and
mhm,
so and certainly that's true within most religious traditions. I mean, think in Buddhism, where in the development of Buddhism, you have on the one hand the goal of individual enlightenment, parinirvana, but then you have the ideal of the bodhisattva, the being who achieves enlightenment but chooses not to then dissipate into the ether, but rather to withhold their own enlightenment for the sake of others. So you have
mhm,
all this universal human pattern, I think, about where that whoever we are, it's bound up with everybody else and everything else. And so ultimately, for a journey to be spiritual, it has to be oriented outside yourself as well as inside yourself.
mhm. Yeah, I wanted to talk about, again, I'm back to the stage of meeting the mentor, but um, I met somebody who is like 7 years older than me, and they introduced me a lot to like Eastern philosophy, religions. So I remember them giving me like the Tao of Pu. I've had that book where I've shared with other people the Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism by Shogun Trungpa. I had studied Hinduism, Taoism, Buddhism, and so forth. And so that helped to round out a lot of my understanding and philosophy. So essentially, it was kind of like its own comparative religion course, that I was involved in. Another book I highly recommend was Houston Smith. Originally, it's called The Religions of Man, but then it was changed to The World's Religions to make it more gender neutral and everything. I think he even did a series eventually on PBS called Wisdom of Faith with Houston Smith. Um, but yeah, there was so much in there, and I think one thing that I learned as well is like when you find the value in other religions, for one, it's kind of like there's this bigger question of what is God or where is God, and so forth. And when you find wisdom and meaning in other religions, and you look at the people that are part of that in a different way. And not only that, that if you meet them, that you're able to relate to them much better. Um, I like the old idea of, let us break bread, and it's kind of like I think, an important part of our spiritual journey is to get outside of our little bubble and to talk to people from different faiths, belief systems, so forth. I know that you've had your own experience of encountering other cultures and interacting with them and so forth. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, or?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so when I was in college, I um, spent a summer in Japan to begin with, and I was involved in the Asian martial arts, which have a spiritual dimension to them. So it was kind of encountering the roots of that. But then I also spent a summer in Nepal, where I studied Tibetan Buddhism, and also kind of encountered the forms of Hinduism you have there in the Kathmandu Valley. And so that direct experience with another culture and its kind of sacred space and the way it talked about things, that was important for me to recognize things within my own biography, within my own tradition as well. And this is definitely, I mean, it's funny that I knew Houston Smith. I met him once. I met Campbell once. So I've encountered these figures that have been very influential in our culture. Um, in the way my own Catholic Christian tradition understands it is to say that that every human being has within them the ability to know God, the ability to know the transcendent, and uh, and that every culture that this it speaks of an awareness. It's not that people get a belief. It's like that you have an awareness. You become aware of the divine, and out of that awareness then comes belief systems, rituals, ethical systems. But if you begin with the premise that this is all something that is intrinsic to human nature, it's a lot easier than to when you encounter another culture or another philosophy to start with the question, well, what insight can do I see in that? What insight or truth can I find there? um, and how does their language relate to my language of talking about it? And maybe we do have some important differences in the way we think about it, but it would be surprising if there was nothing in common, right? Because we're all human, we all have this awareness. And so, in the Catholic tradition, it actually says that human beings have a religious sense, that like a hearing, sight, smell, they have the ability to do this. And not only that, but by recognizing that religions are not just idea systems, but they also, again, because there's this outward movement beyond the self to others, that's why we have, the development of religious communities and way of life and all this. And so in my tradition, we evaluate things not just in terms of what insights their ideas have, but also in terms of what are the values that that empower people to live well with one another. And so there's a great deal of wisdom one can get, even just by living in another culture, but also by seeing how a particular religion tries to motivate and structure, empathy and things like that. So yeah, that's one of the things I love about my own tradition is that it's the only form of Christianity that makes that part of its doctrine, that all religions have truth and holiness, and you need to. But the thing is, you can't just say that. You have to find it. You have to find out what it is. You have to go and talk to the people. You have to know your neighbor. You have to ask them and learn from them, and then and it doesn't mean you cease to be who you are. It just says, yeah, I recognize in you something that is true for me, and I also, can appreciate, how we can express this in many different ways, many different languages. Again, it doesn't mean that people don't have disagreements. There are real disagreements between persons, cultures, religions, but we have to beware of what one of my mentors called the fallacy of inflated differences. And we say because we talk differently, then you're wrong and I'm right. It's probably more complicated than that.
Mhm.
So mentors. Um, yeah, many of my mentors. I mean, because I began my journey when I went to college. Many of my mentors were academics. I mean, they were my teachers, my colleagues, now my students. Um, and in a sense, I would learn from. I would. It's not just that I'd learn stuff from them, but I would see the way they lived, and I would see the way they asked questions, and I say that's the way I want to be. Right. So maybe this is one of the ways in which, in the hero's journey, this may be the boon, the elixir the hero brings back is not necessarily, now here's the truth, but rather I manifest with my way of life, with the way I think, the way I critically think. I question things. I try to appreciate and empathize with. It's these behaviors that can then model how others might imagine themselves living. And so for me, coming out of a fundamentalist background, I didn't really have a lot of models about how to learn and interact with people. So seeing people in college, I said, yeah, that's the way I want to live. That's the way I want to learn how to be like that person, not to be that person, but to learn how they think and maybe to gain some of that for myself. So I would say, yeah, that definitely in my that part of my journey, the intellectual one, it was sort of being very attached to certain people because of how they thought and talked to me. And that's what drew me to Campbell originally, and just trying to absorb sort of their wisdom. And that may be another way of thinking about why we need in our journeys not just to avoid, but not just to recognize bias, but also to absorb the wisdom of others, to identify it and absorb it if possible.
Mhm. One of the things we've talked about too is that I think a big portion of the transition is there's this concept called ego death. So previously, in my religious perspective, I'd be like, well, the goodness is inside this organization, this church, or whatever, and the badness is outside, you know. And so it's very polar opposites. Um, but I think one of the differences for me was within the spiritual journey was to turn inward instead and to look at how a lot of that conflict was within myself. So, previously it'd be like God versus devil, and so forth. But I think even asking, for instance, not that we have God, we possess God, and He's ours or whatever, um, but that asking the question, "What is God?" And that was a much more difficult thing to answer, because I think was it Augustine, who posited the idea of omnipresent, omnipotent, and
That's this is how he begins his confessions, right? This is his most
mhm,
famous work, St. Augustine's Confessions. He begins with this amazing list of questions that he asks, because again, the confessions is sort of it's phrased like a prayer, like he's praying, he's conversing with God, and he's reflecting on his own life. But he begins by saying, how can I communicate with God? How can I call upon God? Because how can I ask God to be present if God is already present?
Hmm.
How can I ask God to come to me if God is already within me? I mean, he problematizes every form of expression that religion uses to try to conceptualize God. And he says, how is this at all possible? Um, and again, he develops his own answers to that, but yeah, he interrogates language
Hmm.
about God and how people can know or experience God. So to have a figure like that at the center of a particular tradition, one would think that the people within that tradition would kind of take seriously that kind of questioning, but often again we prefer the ease of formulas and such. So there's a purpose for those, but again,
Yeah.
too, it's the difference between, it's like Bruce Lee says in Enter the Dragon, you know, look at the moon, don't look at the finger pointing at the moon, right? Or you'll miss
Hmm.
all the heavenly glory. It's the same thing. The function of doctrines in religion is to be the finger pointing to something. But if you get too obsessed with the finger, you forget what it's pointing to.
Well, and I like to me, I saw those eventually those statements of, omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient as being like a Zen koan, So basically it's kind of like you have this belief that the mind can grasp something and hold on to it. And transcendence to me is something that is beyond that. It's so eventually I like the concept too of the dialectic, which is thesis, antithesis, are and you're looking at those things, and eventually that itself is the process of analysis. So it's like a watch and you're taking it apart. But eventually you transcend the opposites and you get the synthesis, which is where you have a deeper understanding of it as being a part of a whole. I like the yin and yang symbol, that it's like you have the light and the dark, but they're both encompassed by the circle, which contains them, and each of them contains a portion of the other. So to me, it's a very deep and profound symbol. There's a lot contained within that. Um, but ultimately, that is the dialectic is seen as the path to enlightenment. So I would like to say the same thing about Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey. That's essentially what he's talking about. I feel like it's been commercialized in sense of movies and so forth, but there's a deeper psychological meaning there that is also ultimately talking about the path to enlightenment.
Yeah, and just even taking these terms like God is this, God is that.
Hmm.
All you need to do is think about the terms themselves, and you realize they don't answer anything. They
Hmm.
just raise more questions. Um, and ultimately I wouldn't say, I'd kind of hesitate about saying synthesis is what happens. I'd say paradox is what happens.
Well, yeah,
You which is again, it's part of the nature of human existence, is we
I would
experience
say
paradox all the time.
synthesis in the terms of it being a whole. And the
Yes,
thing that
yes,
is
there we go.
divided is your understanding of it. That's what's lacking. So there's like a union, essentially. Think of it like a Venn diagram, in logic. And it's kind of like, I think I heard it said something like, God is a circle that encompasses all, but yet, there's like the classic quote of uh, circumference is everywhere but center, or center is everywhere but circumference is nowhere, something like that. So,
Yeah, so it's language games, but we're using language to draw attention to the limitations of language.
absolutely, yeah. Well, and language can be its own trap, because it's like if we say tree, well, what type of tree are you talking about? That's a very broad term, and even the tree itself, when you get down to it, it's like, you have the water that's coming down from the sky, you have the from the rain, you have the sun, you have the roots which are going into the ground. At a certain point, it's no longer just a tree. That's a label that we've put all on it. So understanding it is much more than just knowing the word.
So where are we now? We've talked about mentors.
Well, I'll
What's the
go
next
through the
stage?
stages here. I think that's valuable. There's essentially 12, and you have the first part, which is the ordinary world. So first step, ordinary world, call to adventure, refusal of the call. Number three, number four, meeting with a mentor. Five, crossing the threshold. So coming out of maybe, what you were raised with and going into something else. Six would be tests, allies, and enemies. Seventh is the approach to the inmost cave. I think I talked before about like the inward journey that you take. Eight is the ordeal. Nine is reward, seizing the sword. 10 is the road back. 11 is resurrection. And 12 is return with the elixir.
And the
Right.
specifics, those stages, they're sort of drawn from some typical features of many of these stories.
And 5 through 10 is the special world. So that's kind of like the traveling outward. Although I think there's a paradox here as well, because it's really about traveling inward. And it's like what you gain, what insights you gain from that journey. And
Could you
then,
say some? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
Yeah, could you say something more about the refusal of the call? Remind us what Campbell means by that as a stage of the journey itself.
Well, I mean, I'm going to probably reference Star Wars because it was used in that. And I think of Luke of saying, oh no, I need to do things here on the farm. I need to stay with my aunt and uncle and so forth. And, he had met with Obi-Wan Kenobi, but he was essentially, like Obi-Wan Kenobi saying, well, your father is a great pilot. This was his lightsaber and so forth. And this is kind of like there's um there's something he's giving him. He's like passing on it from one generation to the next. But Luke is just saying, oh, I'm just going to stay here. That's my destiny and so forth. And then life kind of like has a way of just seizing you and thrusting you into a different world. And that's when you're forced to wake up in some sense. That's the beginning of your journey, at least.
Yeah, that's interesting because something I grapple with when I try to teach as well as try to pray this is when I pray the Lord's Prayer. Remember, it has that line at the end about, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. The lead us not into temptation. That's asking God not to subject you to the ordeal.
Mm,
And so here you have the founder of Christianity, Jesus saying, refuse the call. I mean, make part. I mean, obviously, the refusal ends at the second half of it, but it's contained within the very this prayer that Christians pray. It's somehow supposed to encapsulate the journey, right? And
mhm,
so it's really interesting to my mind that within that kind of normative language, it includes a refusal, or at least a, don't subject me to the ordeal piece. And this is, this corresponds to the language of when Jesus is in the garden saying, please don't let me die, but if I must, then I will. But there's this, why is there this moment of refusal that is acknowledged, right? Even for, Jesus of all people,
mhm,
it's acknowledged as being essential to the story. I mean,
mhm,
I think probably people don't think about that because they, oh, Jesus is perfect and all this, and so they're, but still, it's like there has to be this. There's something about the truth of the journey has to acknowledge that there is this resistance to it, or at least there is it, maybe the point of the refusal is that it's a recognition that if I do say yes, this is voluntary, right? This is something I'm choosing to do. I don't have to do it. I could go back to, Uncle Owen and his farm. So the act of refusal is sort of in the story. It's bringing to consciousness the fact that this is a journey I have to decide to make. It can't just be made
mhm.
for.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, in my own journey, it was kind of like I was clinging tightly to the way I was raised. I wasn't going to let go, but it was kind of like life had a different path in store for me. You know, but there was maybe a bit of a paradox too when I entered into a relationship with someone who wasn't of my faith. It was kind of like this thing grips you. At that point, you call it love. And it's kind of like it has this power over you. And it's kind of like I was asking questions, like I was like, how could God be against such a beautiful thing? You know, even though everybody around me was not happy with it, neither her family, my family, whatever. Um, so, but again, I look back on it and I see the, all the tension between us and see the value in that. It wasn't fun to go through necessarily, but I see it as like necessary, you know.
There's a
So
funny thing too. And again, this is sociology, is that, institutions like to protect themselves. They like to keep the in crowd in and the out crowd out. I mean, that's just human nature.
yeah.
But you have this, this strong tradition, and I suspect in many religions of, you marry within the group, and
Hmm.
we
Hmm.
discourage you from
Sure.
marrying outside the group.
Right.
And yet, in the one of the earliest texts of Christianity, this is, Paul's letter to the Corinthians. He too has this very apocalyptic worldview of, the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and we need to be separate from that, unless you're already married with someone out there. And he says, like, marriage is in his terms, love, the love between the insider and the outsider. That's the one thing that is not even a threat to the group. It's actually the love is a form of sanctification. It's something that brings the goodness of you into that other person's life. And so I find it fascinating that even, within apocalyptic texts that say, there's insiders and outsiders, it says, except, love. Love is the one thing that actually that is not opposed to any of
Well,
this.
and you could even say something like, some people say God is love, and then you experience love, and it's like, what could be more divine or closer to that union, you know? And I think that's what's interesting about the spiritual path too, because it's like the recognition that you're not this solitary person on this journey, that the ultimate experience that you have is that of union, which is bliss, you know. So it's kind of like people, I'm sure that they feel that they're doing what the right thing, but they're actually like kind of like trying to keep you from the having the experience. So that is kind of like, within the path, the tests allies enemies. There are people who are like, no, don't go there. But ultimately, I think especially for younger people, a lot of times it's like when they're told no, that's when they're more inclined to actually go and do it. Say, well, what are they trying to keep me from? What is this awareness that I should not know? And it's kind of like a path I think we all have to take in some way or another. So
So we have the refusal, we got the
yes.
mentor.
Yeah, next
Um,
was the approach the inmost cave. I'm reminded of Luke going into the one cave, and I think Yoda said something like, he's like, "What am I going to find in there?" He's like, "Well, what you take with you." And in this case, it was kind of like that. Uh, Basically, the first clue that Darth Vader is his father, and that he contains this darkness within himself. So it's kind of like almost like you have to conquer yourself. Um, the next step was the ordeal. Um,
but before we get to the ordeal, though, that point about confronting yourself, overcoming yourself, discovering yourself as the enemy in the cave.
mm,
Um, I've found that in my own journey, one of the hardest things, um, or one of the most dangerous aspects, is, if you think of yourself as a good person, as someone who wouldn't do bad things, um, that's what the bad people would do. You're good.
mhm,
There is a danger to that thinking, because often that self-image can put you off guard and actually make you more vulnerable to making a terrible mistake someday, because you think you're not the type of person who would do that. So when he goes into the cave and he cuts off the head of Vader and he has his own face there, it's sort of the exposure of, yeah, well, maybe there's maybe I'm part of the problem. Maybe I have to be aware of that. And of course, spiritual journey is about self-awareness.
mhm. There's a couple of things here I'm reminded of. I know part of my path was I have this book sitting next to me on the desk, but it's about the shadow, exploring the shadow. Another portion of this was the dark night of the soul. Dark Night of the Soul to me is kind of like this feeling of almost like emptiness, that if there is a God, it's very far away from you, or not there at all. But it's kind of like a period of trials that you must go through. And the shadow is also kind of like, again, facing yourself. Um, like Luke recognizing that darkness within as well. That it's there's this idea of in psychology called projection, where we want to see only the badness as being in the outside world, which is what, there's a religion I was raised in did as well. It's like, oh, it's all there. It's not within here. We don't have to do any self-reflection because we're good. We have the truth, you know. So, and Scott Peck would talk about, he would say that anytime we make progress spiritually, that there's pain involved in it. So generally, there's like the saying of, we choose the path of least resistance. That's the way a lot of people are. So basically, they're avoiding the pain of looking within. And I feel like if we're going to continue to grow, in some sense, we have to die to ourselves each day. If we're truly looking within and asking, whether we're doing the right thing, we have to do that wrestling, um, which I think is also part of our sacred journeys.
Yeah, no, you had mentioned bliss earlier on as a term that people often refer to as sort of the outcome of
Mhm.
this integration and so forth. And but that too, I think people can often, people who aren't willing to go through the pain of, divesting oneself of all these false ideas within oneself and or self images. The alternative of spiritual journey becomes just, getting high, right? That's that they
Mm,
identify bliss not with genuine well-being,
mhm,
but with simply the experience of pleasure.
mhm.
And this is, something that Aristotle talks a lot about around when he says, the goal of life is happiness. He says it does, happiness doesn't necessarily mean experiencing pleasure all the time. It can mean a lot of pain, but it's a
Yeah.
peace that comes from living the truth, living in the truth, rather than just thinking that you have the truth.
Yeah. I remember hearing something about, I think it was the Epicurean hedonists, and like people think that hedonist means that you just like pursue pleasure and you do whatever you want and so forth. But there's actually a principle in this is that, it's kind of like the idea of moderation in all things, because if you actually consume too much and you become fat, that's actually not beneficial to
Right.
you. So, to maximize your pleasure, you might actually want to moderate what you eat rather than just eating whatever you want. So,
Yeah. The difference between limited and unlimited goods. Food is limited good.
right, right.
But even it's true even for, people who are quote into spirituality, is often it becomes just looking for a high, for an experience of,
Sure, sure.
an emotional, a subjective experience of happiness, rather than what actually makes for happiness.
Yeah. And I think too, it's kind of like if somebody would want to start on the spiritual journey, because I feel like there's a lot of people who go through this refusal to call, and it's kind of like I look at them and I say, I don't know if you understand how much pain there is on this path. It's
Yeah.
not an easy path. And I think that's why it's also called the hero's journey, because I like the quote that says that the greatest mountain is the threshold, meaning that most people won't even cross the threshold because their mind will be self-defeating and say, "Oh, there's no reason I can do this." I think a great example is actually in Back to the Future when Marty's going, "What did they say? I'm not good enough?" So he's like questioning his own self, and if he follows that line of thinking, he's not going to go anywhere. But the whole point of the journey that he takes is like, oh yeah, I can do this, and feeling empowered to do it and to move forward. So,
Yeah, and persistence is an important value in all this. I remember in the martial arts, one of my senseis said, there is only one truth, and the one truth is training,
mm,
practice. It's like there's
mm,
no magical way that you can get stuff or become,
Hmm.
some impossibly, powerful person. That's not what it is. It's doing things habitually, right? Doing
Yeah.
things on a daily basis, and only then do you actually get better.
Yeah.
I try to tell this to my students who are trying to learn how to write English. You don't get to be good writers by using AI. You have to actually work at it every day. And again, the work, practice, the training, that one truth
Yeah.
is obviously true of spiritual, struggles as well.
Yeah, I think I would draw a parallel to like your martial arts, for example. There was a time where I played tennis and I was in tennis leagues, and it was kind of like the best matches were where you're evenly matched with someone and you're really duking it out, and they bring out the best in you. And at
Right.
the end of the day, it doesn't matter who wins or loses. It's like, no, you brought out the best in me, and I thank you for this. So at the end of the match, we'd go and we'd shake hands, or something like that. So not to see, and it's kind of like, who would you be without someone to contest with, to go against you? So it's
Right.
that tug of war that takes place, but that's what brings out, calls out, what is within you. So,
Yeah.
and I think that that's what we're encountering within the world as well. If we answer the call, it's kind of like it's trying to bring out the best in you if you'll just say yes to that journey. So,
Yeah. Robert Greenleaf, the kind of the modern pioneer of the idea of servant leadership, said this very thing when he's talking about. He says, a servant leader, they don't do well because they have perfect people to work with, because there are no perfect people. It says that
mhm,
the good leader is the one who's able to bring out the best in each individual member of the team so that collectively they can accomplish something more than they could have ever done on their own. So again, this idea of drawing out what the potential within the person, that's what makes it worth doing. And that's how we get better at something.
mhm. I feel like we're pretty close to a good closing point. What do you think? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Um,
Any other pieces on the journey we want to talk about? Last ideas.
I did want to say, and maybe this is one of my closing thoughts or the closing thought. I wanted to talk about, like, after you have the illumination, so to speak, this would be the return to we go from the special world to the ordinary world. The last stage of the special world is as reward seizing the sword. And then we have the road back, resurrection, return with the elixir. And the reason why I think it's important to see the hero's journey as like the path to enlightenment is because I would contrast it with the mundane world, and you're going to come back to the mundane world, and you're going to say, "Hey, there's this path to get this thing, but it's not something that you can really sell. It's not tangible. It's something that's within you, but it's of great value." Um, so yeah, and I
There's a
think that.
parable, just a big piggyback on it. One of the parables of Jesus is really interesting. He has two parables, very short ones. One is the parable of the treasure, the buried treasure, right? Someone finds a treasure buried in a field and they sell everything to get it.
Mhm,
But then there's one that follows it, which is a lot more interesting. This is the parable of the merchant who is seeking to buy pearls, and he finds the pearl of great price, and then he sells everything to have it. Um, but the reward isn't the pearl in that parable. The reward is ceasing to be a merchant. He himself changes. He is no longer someone whose job is to purchase things and sell them again. It's to purchase something and have it, and he is no longer a merchant at that point. So the idea that one has changed as a result of that is the reward, right?
mhm,
Um, and let's see, my last thoughts, closing thoughts on this. Yeah, this is more of a practical piece. So one of the things I've noted is that when when one thinks about, anyone can do it, anyone can pursue their purpose, their ultimate purpose, their spiritual journey in any context, religious, philosophical, or otherwise. It can happen and must happen everywhere. But what is the function of religious practices with regard to this? And I'm thinking especially of prayer and meditation, which are, for me, they are pretty much the same thing. But the importance of stopping what you're doing. I mean, this is the basic distinction that Campbell makes between the ordinary world and the special world. That in the hero's journey, the narratives of a person who leaves the ordinary world and goes through the spiritual world and then comes back. But the function of prayer as a daily activity, some kind of contemplation, is absolutely essential because because there has to be a moment where you stop what you're doing or what you're thinking or what you're normally whatever you're doing as part of your ordinary daily routine, and you have to not do any of that. And it's one of those things you can't really cut corners on, because if you believe that there is some transcendent reality out there, and you have no practice to acknowledge that, whatever the practice may be, it's harder to integrate what you do in your ordinary life with that goal unless there's an opportunity to stop and do nothing.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, and it might involve words. I find, I learned my first form of prayer was Buddhist meditation, which involves no words. But for me, I find that words are important because they it's sort of like, whole brain learning, all of your senses, both the quiet part where you're not saying anything, but also the talking and the bodily postures and all these things. Everything that you do um, becomes part of this practice, whatever it is. And it could be journaling. It can be any sort of activity that is set apart from the ordinary. That's my one insight. I think that you have to have something that gives you that space to reflect on what you do the rest of the time, and to think about, how what you're doing is either leading you in the direction of that ultimate goal or not. Because it's in those moments of reflection that we're able to interrogate our own delusions, on our own, misconceptions, and maybe the misconceptions people are foisting on us. There has to be reflection at some point. That's part of, I think, essential to the spiritual journey. So I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think I wanted to add, talking about the spiritual journey, because I came out of religion, and then for a while, religion became my science. But then within science, you realize there are certain questions that it cannot answer. So I very much got into philosophy, comparative religion, um, psychology, mythology, so forth. Um, but at the end of that, I had my experience, and then I penned something, and it said something effective that I no longer see forms of flesh and blood, but it's my eyes which have changed, and now I see only spirits.
Hmm.
So to understand ourselves of that, like the mundane view would be like, oh, these are just, you know, carbon-based life forms, But now, I see only spirits, and that the reason why we're here, if we take advantage of it, is about advancing our own spirit to be what we can become, which is not just ourselves, but to be something greater than that, to commune with God, so to speak, or the divine, I prefer.
Amen.
All right.
Okay. Thanks
Thank you
for
for,
thanks for your time.
yeah,
Hopefully we'll see you at another one of these sessions.
yeah, definitely. Thank you for participating and being a part of it.